Welcome to our third session of Grief 101. Tonight we're going to be discussing grieving a death during COVID-19. My name's Sheila Bourgeois. I'm the Bereavement and Wellness Coordinator at Hospice Peterborough, and tonight I have the honor and privilege of presenting with Alice.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Alice Citrum, and I'm one of the Grief Chat facilitators, which is a grief group that's offered at Hospice Peterborough.
So we're going to start our session tonight with a land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe. We offer our gratitude to our First Nations for their care for and teachings about our earth and our relations. May we honor those teachings. We acknowledge that where we meet is the land and territory of the Anishinaabe people. We gather with gratitude to our Mississauga neighbors. We say miigwech to thank them and their Aboriginal peoples for taking care of this land from time immemorial and for sharing this land with those of us who are newcomers. Out of that gratitude, we are called to treat the land, its plants, animals, stories, and its peoples with honor and respect. We are all treaty people. We acknowledge that the land on which Hospice Peterborough is located is a traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Mississauga and in the territory covered by Treaty 20. Before we get started, we just want to let you know that we take confidentiality is very important to us at Hospice Peterborough. And due to the format of this session, we aren't able to ensure complete confidentiality. If you would like to remain anonymous throughout the session, but still use the chat box, you are able to rename yourself. If you click on, there should be 3 dots and there will be a button that says rename. You can rename yourself to anything you want if you prefer to remain anonymous. If you do have questions throughout our session, again, we ask that you keep your microphone muted throughout our session, but we encourage you to use the chat box and we'll do our best to address the questions at the end of the session. And where to go for support. Anytime we're talking about grief and loss, it can bring up a lot of emotions. And so if you are feeling after this session like you need some additional support, we will be sharing my email at the end of the session, and I do my best to respond the following day. Or also know that you can reach out to other supports in your community. So we're going to do a poll before we get started. That'll just give us a little bit of information about who's joining us for this session tonight. So the first question is, we're asking what grief during COVID means in your life. And we want to know if you're grieving a death that occurred before COVID, you're grieving a death that has occurred during COVID, you're supporting someone who's grieving, or you're interested in this session for other reasons. And you can always choose not to answer. We're also wondering if you participated in either of our previous sessions, and that could be either attending the event live or watching the video on YouTube.
All right, so all of you have already voted. So I'm going to end the poll.
Excellent. Thank you all for participating in that. So most of you who are attending tonight are grieving a death that has occurred during COVID. And we want to acknowledge that we know how complicated experiencing the death of someone significant in your life has been during COVID, and we'll touch on that tonight. There's many of you that also are grieving a death that occurred before COVID, which has presented its own unique challenges to the grieving process for you. And then we are also touching on tonight, for those of you who are here because you're supporting somebody, we will be talking about how best to support people who are grieving right now. And most of you are back from a previous session, so thank you for joining us again. So we are going to, just as we did in the previous sessions, we're going to take a moment just to connect with our breath and ground ourselves before we get into the content of the session tonight. So if you can get yourself into a comfortable position, and feel free to close your eyes for this mindfulness time, or you can leave them open and just gently rest them on a spot in the room. Begin by paying attention to your breathing and let yourself take a few nice, deep, full breaths. Let yourself breathe into your abdomen, bringing your breath way down into your belly and allowing your out breath to be a real letting go kind of breath. With that out breath, release any tension or discomfort or distraction that you don't need to hold on to. Let any outside noises around you be in the background of your awareness. Now begin to imagine yourself going to a place that's very beautiful to you. It's very peaceful, safe, and secure. It might be a place that you've actually been in your life, or it might be a place you visited in your imagination. It can be a new place or some combination of these, but just a spot that is beautiful to you, a spot that is peaceful, and a spot that is safe. Look around this space and notice what you imagine seeing in this special, peaceful place. Notice the colors and the shapes of the things that you see. As you notice what you see, notice if you're hearing any sounds in this special place, or if it's just very quiet. Notice the temperature and the time of day. Notice what the season of the year is. And especially notice any feelings that you're having of peacefulness or relaxation or comfort that you feel in this space, and allow them to be there. Find a spot in this place where you feel most comfortable and allow yourself to get settled there, simply enjoying your few moments in this space. As you deeply relax, allow the beauty, peacefulness, and safety to recharge your body and mind, and even your spirit. Know that you can come back here and enjoy this anytime you choose, simply by deciding to shift your attention to your inner world and allowing your breathing to get deep and comfortable, and imagining yourself coming to this beautiful, peaceful space. If your mind wanders or gets distracted, simply take another deep breath and refocus your mind on this beautiful space. Know that this space is always within you, and that by remembering it or thinking about it, you can touch into those feelings of calmness, peacefulness, and serenity, and bring those qualities more and more into your daily life. When you're ready, you can open your eyes and once again focus on the screen and on the session and this time that we're going to share together. So tonight we're going to be talking about grief and COVID. And we want to acknowledge that there's different experiences in this session tonight. Some of you have carried your grief into COVID. Some of you started carrying your grief during COVID. And there are additional losses that all of you are experiencing due to the nature of our changing reality. And what we'd like to invite you to do right now, if you choose, you certainly don't have to, but if you'd like to share in the chat box the name of the person or people you're remembering as you listen to this content tonight, we welcome you to do that. And we encourage those of you that are participating to look at the chat box and to read these names of the people who are being remembered and who are very much a part of this space tonight. As you're sharing those names, we're going to discuss types of losses that are important for us to be aware of as we navigate grief in the context of COVID. And some of these terms may be terms that you're familiar with already. Some of them may be terms that you've heard us use in the previous sessions, but we're just briefly going to touch on all these different types of losses and the impact that COVID is having. So non-death losses are anything that is significant to us. When we lose it, there can be a grieving process attached to it, and it is a loss for us. Certainly during COVID, there's been important events that have needed to be canceled or postponed. There's been job losses. People have grieved the fact that they can't be with their family in the ways that they have in the past. And those losses are all significant. The other thing which we've touched on in previous session is secondary losses. So when someone dies, that is a primary loss for us, but often there's a ripple effect that means there's additional losses that we have. Sometimes it's losses of friends because that person was our connection to other friends. The loss could include monetary, like not having as much income, or losses of support that you don't have that you've previously had access to. Ambiguous loss is grieving somebody who is still alive. And so there's two ways that this can present for people. So one is grieving someone who's physically present, but psychologically absent. So this happens in cases of dementia, when there's been a traumatic brain injury. And then the other form of ambiguous loss is grieving someone who's physically gone, but you don't know what happened to that person. And so if somebody's disappeared or you've lost contact. So those are two types of ambiguous loss. Cumulative loss is experiences, so it can be when you have multiple losses in a short time frame, or it can also occur when you experience a new loss and you haven't completely grieved the prior loss. And we've talked about how grief is not something that ever really ends, but when you haven't had a chance to properly grieve a loss and you experience additional losses, that's considered cumulative losses. And as you can see with talking about the non-death losses that people are experiencing in COVID, there's certainly a culture of cumulative loss. Sorry, my tongue is getting tied on that word tonight, that we're all experiencing. Non-finite loss is when our life doesn't match up with what we expected. So we had anticipated by a certain point in our life, we would have a certain type of job, or we would have a house. And when those things, when life doesn't meet those expectations, it creates this loss that kind of is overriding everything. And so we're certainly living in a world right now where our expectations of what we would be doing in December of 2020 do not match up with our reality often. And so that is non-finite loss would be the word to describe that kind of loss. Anticipatory loss is grief that occurs before a potential loss. And some people believe that because they're anticipating a loss or they know that it's coming, that when they actually experience the full grief, that they'll be more prepared for it. But nothing can prepare us for significant losses in our life. And then disenfranchised loss is when we believe that we're denied the right to grieve, and we may not get the support or validation that we need to grieve properly when we believe that we're experiencing a disenfranchised loss. And for example, non-death losses are often disenfranchised losses because we feel like we don't deserve the right to grieve over a job loss, or to grieve over a missed graduation or a missed significant birthday celebration. But those are real losses for people, and there is a grieving process that gets attached to those. And then the other thing in COVID is sometimes people who experience deaths due to COVID can feel a sense of disenfranchised loss because they feel that their loved one becomes a statistic and not their mother or their father or their significant person. They just become a number to people, and their grief isn't seen by the community around them. Some people may also ask questions that lead people to not feel like they're permitted their grief. They may believe that because their loved one didn't take certain precautions, that they're to blame for contracting COVID. So there's ways that COVID deaths often become disenfranchised loss. And then the last one is traumatic loss, and we're just going to touch on that a little bit, because traumatic loss is any time a death overwhelms our ability to cope, it's considered traumatic loss, but it usually requires some additional support to address the trauma and the loss. It's like there's two pieces coming together when there's traumatic loss. So we're going to watch a video from Maureen Pollard. And just a reminder for those of you who may be joining us for the first time, these videos, sometimes the visual content can be a bit choppy, but if you just close your eyes, the audio should be fairly clear for you.
The experience of grief can be compounded when we are also experiencing the impact of a pandemic and all of the challenges continuing to go on in the world around us. We feel loss on so many layers. We're losing our daily routines, the ways that we would normally connect with people, hopes and dreams and events that we would have been participating in. And so as you include your personal grief in the layers of what is happening to you, what you're feeling, remember, this is heavy. It's a lot. It's a lot to take in, and it's a lot to adapt to. So be patient with yourself. Hold compassion for yourself and know that you are doing the best that you can, and that that's good enough. In these moments when you are grieving your personal loss under this heavy blanket of the weight of the world, take the time to soothe yourself. Calm, deep, slow breaths with activities that make you feel comfortable as much as possible. And know that what you're feeling is normal, given these absolutely abnormal circumstances.
So the first experience that we're going to speak to a little bit is for those of you who carried your grief into COVID. So those of you who experienced a death prior to COVID, but have been managing your grief throughout this pandemic. So what we've heard from many people who have reached out for grief support is people have said they felt like they regressed in their grieving process, or that their grief has grown. And for many people, they had developed coping strategies or ways to manage their grief and may not have access to those in the same way. And so it feels as if your grief has grown, or if you're you're feeling like you're not managing your grief as well, but what actually has happened is those coping strategies have been taken away, and also the many distractions that you may have had prior to COVID have been reduced. And so it feels bigger even though it hasn't changed in size. And it's so important to remember that those strategies, those coping strategies that you've developed may be available to you in different ways. And how might you invite them into your life in the context of COVID? Or what new strategies, because if you had strategies to manage before, what new strategies might you be able to use in place of what had been working for you previously? The other thing that can be challenging is that you may be thinking a lot about how your person would have helped you through all of this, and that maybe this would have all felt more manageable if your person was here for you. And we recognize that those are thoughts that many people are having through this time.
And Sheila, I'd add to that, if you carried your grief into COVID, it can already feel like your bandwidth, what you have is already depleted, that you're already exhausted from those early parts of grief, and then a crisis hits. And so you're already depleted coming into that crisis as well. And so you weren't coming in at that functional level that maybe somebody else may have if they weren't already also carrying grief into COVID.
Yeah, and we talked about those cumulative losses. And that all of the stressors and losses that you've experienced in COVID are you're experiencing on top of that grief that you were already dealing with. And so really being gentle with yourself when you find you're not feeling as motivated or energetic to do things, when you don't have the same interest level in things you've enjoyed in the past, recognizing the amount of stress and pressure that you're under. And then we also know that there's been a lot of isolation and a lot of time for thinking in the context of COVID. And so, again, things that people say is that they may feel some guilt that they're glad that their person didn't have to live through this complicated and changing time. People talk about feeling irritable and annoyed because people are talking about how challenging it is to be isolated and to not be able to see their family. And they may be annoyed by things that they may be upset by things you've been dealing with for much longer. And so your frustration level may be high because these are things you've been managing for much longer. And so this is just the reality that other people are waking up to, the reality of living with all these losses and this grief. And you may also find that you're thinking of your person a lot and really missing having them with you in that space, which may make you feel even more isolated. And so Alice will be touching later on how you can connect with them and still connect with the comfort that's available to you in that relationship, because the relationship with your person, even with them not being physically present, is still very much a important connection in your world, and maybe even more important in this changing world. And then there's also the reality of feeling grief because this changed world is a world that your person was never a part of. And so sometimes acknowledging that the world has changed and they never got to experience this can add to the weight of your loss right now as well. And then for those of you who have experienced a death during COVID, there are some unique circumstances. Death during COVID has looked very, very different. And for some of you, your loved ones you may not have had the same access to them, either individually or as a family unit to support them at the end of their life, which can make the grieving process that much more challenging and complicated. And your loved one's death may not have looked like what you imagined it may look like, and may not have looked like what their wishes were. They may have discussed with you what they had hoped the end of their life would look like, and that may not have been possible in the context of COVID. And then there's also, with death during COVID, sometimes medical care may have been delayed because you feared accessing services at a hospital for fear of exposure. And so there can sometimes be some questioning about what we did as our loved ones dealt with illness or approached the end of life. So those are all realities of what death during COVID has looked like for people. And then the last one is that some of your loved ones may have been alone at the time of their death, and acknowledging that you were there with them in love and in spirit, but may not have been able to be physically present with them.
And then if you're also grieving a traumatic death during COVID, as Sheila highlighted earlier, the trauma is also complicated by COVID and the pandemic as well, and we just want to acknowledge that.
Mm-hmm. And accessing services and supports can be trickier as we navigate these challenging events. And so mourning also has looked so different in the context of COVID, and I don't need to tell many of you that. The memorialization, the opportunity to have a ritual to honor your loved one, may not have looked like what you felt was the right way to honor your person. There may have been a much smaller service. There may have been a virtual service in place of people physically being present. And many people have opted to delay a celebration of life or a funeral until people can join again. And rituals can be so important. And I would encourage you, and we can talk about this a little bit more in coping, but finding even small rituals that sometimes is just about you and your person, or your close family and your person, and having an opportunity to honor their life. Because as difficult as dying during COVID may have been for people, it's really their life. It's your person's life that you want to remember and honor and connect to. And so sometimes people have had the opportunity to just gather with a few people and really honor that person until there can be an opportunity for a larger ritual. And then again, the impact of social isolation to the mourning process. So typically you would have people coming over to offer meals or have a cup of tea with you, offer a hug, hold your hand, be present with you. And social isolation may have not made a lot of that available to you. And so it may leave you feeling forgotten, or like your grief is not as important, and it is. And that is why we're offering this session tonight, is to give you tools to manage and allow you to connect with other people who are also grieving through this very difficult time. So we're going to hear from Linda, who's going to talk about the pandemic and triggers for grief.
I would say that this pandemic is triggering so many things for so many people, because loss is something that doesn't happen and then unhappen. So for people who have experienced any kind of loss, all of the uncertainty and the fear that we're experiencing right now, and our loss of freedom, our loss of, for some people, health, our loss of jobs, our loss of the ability to spend time with loved ones and hug people and socialize and go out and do what we need to do without the fear of our own impact. All of these losses trigger for some people the emotions that they have felt in the past during the loss. And for some people, the anxiety and stress that this is triggering in people is a new experience, because Some people don't have the experience with loss and the strategies and the ways of reassuring themselves that they can move forward. So the triggers for some people are absolutely brand new and terrifying. And again, same storm, different boat. Every single person is experiencing this pandemic in their own way. And the triggers, for example, Mother's Day coming up, for people who have lost a mother, it's a very difficult time. They can't even go to a cemetery or be with their family members and spend time together. And for people whose mothers are alive and they can't celebrate together, and particularly those who have mothers in nursing homes or retirement homes, again, a trigger of huge loss and, again, anxiety, stress, worry, fear, guilt. Those are all the emotions that are being triggered, and we have to learn how to replace those emotions with emotions that work for us and with strategies that feel better, because we either fill our head and fill our fears with negative stuff, or we fill our head and our emotions with whatever helps us get through this in the best way possible.
And that video leads us right into talking about how do we cope with grief during COVID.
So I really liked what Linda said about same storm, different boat. And then to put it into the context of coping with grief during COVID, we're in the same storm, we have different boats, and some of those boats, we have holes in those boats, we have leaks happening, we might have lots of people that are in our boat with us because we're also in a caregiver role, either as a parent or with another family member. Us ourselves are injured because of the grief that we're carrying. And so I just want to start with that sort of metaphor or symbolism around when we're talking about coping. We're not talking about fixing. We're not talking about having these quick sort of antidotes to what we're going through, but how do we endure that storm as we move through it? So the first thing, so one of the things we're going to talk about, Sheila, if we can go to the next slide. That's okay. So the first sentence is really, I think, important as an umbrella around when we're talking about coping, is being gentle with ourselves. So what do I mean when I say be gentle with yourself? I mean, we talked a lot about this in the last session about the shoulds. I should do this. I should be doing that. I should be feeling this way or that way. So that's what we mean when we say gentle with ourselves, which is also about what are we saying to ourselves? What's our inner voice telling us? Who are we surrounding ourselves with when we're talking about caring for ourselves and coping? The next point about media, really important, especially when we're talking about in the context of traumatic grief. Often if we're experiencing or we've experienced a traumatic grief, we're already feeling very exposed, very vulnerable. It almost feels as if the nerve, like this, our skin is no longer there, and everything that we feel is very hyper aroused. Everything around us can feel very triggering and difficult to endure. So media, when we're talking about COVID, it's often talking about lockdowns, how many deaths are happening on a daily basis, how many people are contracting COVID, businesses shutting down. So none of it is there's no positive media on COVID. A lot of it is anxiety driven. And so there's something you can do, which is to limit that exposure that you're doing for yourself, which is also being kind to yourself. It's not saying that that is not important to you. It's acknowledging that you need to limit that for yourself right now. So that's an invitation. Taking care of your body. And we're not talking about big stuff here. We're not talking about massages and spas and things like that. We're talking about little things like breathing. sitting down and having, like, doing that meditation that Sheila beautifully put us, invited us to join in. It could be things like sleep hygiene, like I'm going to set a time that I'm going to sleep and a time that I'm going to wake up. So even just being caring for your body in those small ways, limiting excessive use of substances, things like that can be taking care of your body in small, manageable ways. Connecting with others, we're doing that tonight. We're connecting with each other in a way that's in a way that we can right now. I mean, obviously this would, we would love to be in person, but we can't, but we're finding ways to connect anyway. And then honoring your grief and your feelings. You did that tonight by typing the name of your person, or even just thinking of them as you're coming into the space with us. And you're doing that too, because we are acknowledging that people are putting things in the chat about ways that they were feeling because of the loss that they're experiencing, or things that they've been doing since. So that's you honoring your grief by doing those small things that you're talking and sharing it with other people. So that those are all things that you're doing to cope. A little bit more on coping. These are more, I guess, more practical strategies. So talking about inviting people to host conference calls where you can either share stories, pictures of the person, create sort of memorials on social media, a virtual memory book, which would be, with pictures or even stories or events in that person's life that are significant. Connecting with grief support services. Again, you're doing that tonight, whether it's for yourself or for someone you're supporting. One of the things that is coming up for hospice Peterborough that we just want to kind of bring up tonight is if you are already following hospice on social media, whether it be Instagram, Facebook, or subscribing to their newsletter, and you can still do that at any time, whether again it's for you or for a friend. There's information of different, I want to say events, but they're not in person. But they're still events because it's surrounding a certain time of year or a situation. And so there's a holiday memories event which involves putting a dove with a person's name. It used to be on a tree, and now they're going to be shifting a little bit to have the doves hanging around the fence at hospice, and all that information can be learned via newsletter or social media. Again, one of those things we're talking about is this is a way of coping, because it's a way to remember your person, acknowledging your grief and your feelings that you're having, which is, I'm missing my person, especially this time of year. And so, Sheila, is there anything else that I should mention about the Memories Tree event?
So just that this will be virtual, and the doves will physically be at hospice, and we'll have instructions on to how to get your dove, or if you're outside of the Peterborough area, you'll be able to share your person's name, and we'll write their name on a dove, and we'll have them on the fence surrounding hospice. So as Alice said, either watch for an email or follow our social media, and we'll have more instructions on how to do that.
Thank you. And the other one that's on this list is reading books about grief and loss. And some people might say, well, I don't want to read a psychoeducation book about the stages of grief. That's not helpful to me. But what we mean by that is there are books out there, especially children's books, and Sheila knows a lot more about that than I do, as she works with our children and teens and families in the context of her work in hospice. But there's something magical that happens when you share those stories with children. And I personally love the books that hospice has shared with their families around grief and loss. I think that there's a lot to that can be gained from those books, even as an adult. And then it's also another opportunity to connect with your little people in the house, or in your bubble or in your family, whether you're reading to them virtually or maybe you're doing it in person, around that bond and sharing that kind of grief experience with a young person. It can be quite supportive for your own grief as well.
So I just want to pop in, Alice, and let you know that Natalie also shared that you will be able to print off the doves at home. So there's one at home for you as well as one at hospice.
Nice.
And then somebody also shared The Invisible String, which is a favorite book at hospice. It's a great book that really honors that continued connection that you still have to your person, even though they're not physically present.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that's it for coping.
So if anyone has other strategies that you've used throughout COVID to cope with your grief, we would welcome you sharing those in the chat box so that other people may find things that they'd like to try. Somebody's already shared that they're working on memory boxes for their grandchildren for Christmas, remembering their family member. So we'll continue to share those as you share them with us.
And also, I want to just say that some of the coping pieces around grief have a time, are very time sensitive. And I mean that by some things that help you in early parts of your grief might not help you down the road, and vice versa. Things that people are doing later on, further away from the day from the event or from the death, might be more helpful then than it would be for you early on, or you might not be ready for those things, and that's okay. These aren't prescriptive. This is, again, your pace with what you are able to sort of cope with, and are you able to manage as you're also going through COVID. So I just want to kind of switch gears here a little bit about, in the same realm as we're talking about coping, it's really important to talk about how we're impacted, not just physically, not just in the day-to-day routines with COVID, not just about the adjustments that we're forced to make while we're kind of going through this new normal, but it's also about how do we then how do we carry our soul into this pandemic and into this grief experience? How do we care for both our soul and also manage all of the things that come with a global pandemic? Because that's what it's done. It's more than just about unsettling our minds. The pandemic has unsettled our souls. And if you're bringing grief into the pandemic, or you're grieving during the pandemic because someone's died, your soul's already unsettled. Your soul is already hurting, and then this has happened. There's not going to be a one-size-fits-all formula, as we've said that several times, and that's, I think, an important message to repeat, because a lot of the messages that we receive out there in society and in our culture can feel prescriptive, can feel like, well, you should do this, or this might help you. It's really about what's going to fit your needs. And so how do we find ourselves, how do we make our way through that path that leads us from grief to despair to then healing? And I think that's where we want to try and shift now this conversation, is how do we begin to heal? How do we even talk about healing in the context of what we're dealing with? Can we start to talk about those things? The video we're going to play, a video around this theme of supporting someone grieving during COVID. So several of you have talked about, had indicated at the beginning of the video of the session tonight that you're here because you're supporting somebody. So we want to acknowledge those folks who are here tonight for that reason, and we want to thank you for coming and being a good friend and being a good person to your person. And that's really important that we have people like you, because as you'll see in the video that we're going to play, how important it can be to acknowledge and be with someone else's pain, and how difficult that can be, but how powerful it can be. This is just an image talking about grief support instructions. And I know I just went on about talking about nothing's prescriptive, and then I'm showing you an image about instructions. But really what it's saying is good grief support is not about a checklist. I sent flowers. I checked in a vague kind of way to see how they're doing. Good grief support is this cycle of checking in and offering love and comfort and support to your person, and then repeating that over and over again. It's an ongoing and evolving relationship with your person. It's not just a one-off, and it can change from one check-in to the next, depending on where that person is. And it's really about letting that person lead in the way that you're supporting them. So the video we're going to play is by a woman named Megan Devine.
So I need to let you know, Alice, somebody actually has just commented that she started reading It's Okay That You're Not Okay by Megan Devine, right as you're talking about leading into the video. So it's
great. I've read that book as well, and it's amazing. I love the way she talks about grief. So Megan Devine actually, she's speaking also from a personal place as well. And she lost her husband in a very traumatic and tragic and sudden way. And so, and she was a therapist before this tragedy happened. So she comes with both lenses, which makes her messaging so much more powerful because of the way she talks about it. So this video is by Megan Devine. It's about 3 to 4 minutes long. It's incredibly powerful. So we'll play that now for you.
So what do we do about all the pain we see in the world? All the pain we feel in our own lives? And why does it seem like our best efforts to help somebody feel better always backfire? I've been studying intense grief and loss, baby death, violent crimes, accidents, suicides, and natural disasters. And I've learned something really interesting. Cheering people up, telling them to be strong and persevere, helping them move on, it doesn't actually work. It's kind of a puzzle. It seems counterintuitive, but the way to help someone feel better is to let them be in pain. This is true for those giant losses and the ordinary everyday ones. Educator Parker Palmer writes, "The human soul doesn't want to be advised or fixed or saved. It simply wants to be witnessed exactly as it is." He's talking about acknowledgement here. Acknowledgement is this really amazing multi-tool. It makes things better even when they can't be made right. For example, somebody's struggling. Their baby died, or there's been a bad accident, or their mom got sick, and they're just sad. It's way more helpful to join them in their pain than it is to cheer them up. But here's what we tend to do instead. "You have 2 other children, you need to find joy in them." Or, "You know what you need? You just need to go out dancing and shake it off." Or, "I felt really sad once. Did you try acupuncture?" We're not really sure what to do with someone's pain, so we do what we've been taught. We look on the bright side. We try to make people feel better. We give them advice. It's not like this is nefarious. I mean, we try to cheer people up because we think that's our job. We're not supposed to let people stay sad. The problem is, you can't heal somebody's pain by trying to take it away from them. Now, acknowledgement does something different. When a giant hole opens up in someone's life, it's actually much more supportive to acknowledge that hole and let pain exist. It's actually a radical act to let things hurt. It goes against what we've been taught. In order to really support you, I have to acknowledge that things really are as bad as they feel to you. If I try to cheer you up, you end up defending yourself and your feelings. If I give you advice, you feel misunderstood instead of supported. And I don't get what I want either, because I wanted you to feel better. It's pretty rare that you could actually talk somebody out of their pain. Rarely does the admonishment to look on the bright side actually heal things for someone. It just makes them stop telling you about their pain. It's so tempting to try to make things better. When somebody shares something painful, it's much more helpful to say, "I'm sorry that's happening. Do you want to tell me about it?" To be able to say, "This hurts," without being talked out of it, that's what helps. Being heard helps. It seems too simple to be of use, but acknowledgement can be the best medicine we have. It makes things better, even when they can't be made right.
That's a good video. And I watched it several times and I still get something out of it every time I see it. So we're gonna sort of end tonight talking about this idea and this notion of resilience in the time of loss and the pandemic, which many of you and most of you are probably going like, what the heck? How are we talking about resilience in the context of what we're dealing with? So before we even go there, I just want to go over sort of what are our assumptions about the world that makes us feel resilient, or makes us feel like we have sort of this grasp that we got this, we can deal with this. So when we talk about well-being in the context of resilience, there are essentially 4 assumptions or expectations that we have, which is others can be trusted, that communities are safe, that life is orderly and events are predictable, and that society is just. So when we talk about these assumptions, and in the pandemic and loss has shattered most, if not all, of these assumptions, how do we then make meaning out of this? How do we restore order, and how do we restore our purpose for going on with our lives? So when we talk about meaning making and meaning restoration in the context of resilience, we talked about this at the last session when we talked about grief and loss, and how at the early stages of grief, in the early parts of our grief, meaning reconstruction and meaning making is really not something that we're able to manage or even see clearly or understand why we would even make meaning out of something so tragic or something so difficult and challenging. But that meaning reconstruction and meaning making happens later, happens over time. It's not this one-off, that sort of aha moment of, oh, now I get it. Now I can see the meaning behind all of this. That it's little small pieces that kind of come together both intentionally and unintentionally, because we also start to change through our grief. And so meaning making and meaning reconstruction is really central to our healing. But it's really important to note that when we're in that place, like we are right now with the pandemic, and some of you are in that place in your grief, we can't see the meaning yet, because we've never been through this pandemic. We've never been through a pandemic before. We're going through this for the first time. And so it's okay that we're not able to see those pieces yet, but knowing that we're all collectively going through a grieving process with the pandemic, and then couple that with the loss that you're carrying as well. And so having those pieces of uncertainty happen and experiencing those pieces of uncertainty is normal and it's to be expected. I really like this image in the context when we're talking about resilience, because this tree has clearly been harmed, has clearly been hurt. It's damaged, it's broken. And then as we see, if we go further down the bark and down the branches, we see growth, we see life, we see leaves, we see all of those things happening, even though it's also broken. Those two things actually can exist together. It doesn't have to be one or the other. We can hold space for both the broken pieces and the pieces that are trying to live and trying to still go on with life. Resilience, we often think about resilience in the context of bouncing back. That term is often used when we in the context of resilience, and it's not. Resilience is not about bouncing back, and we can't be expected to bounce back from loss. We cannot go back to normal life as we knew it, because the magnitude of what we're dealing with is just too big, and we have to acknowledge that. We have to make space for that. So I hope that when you're hearing this talk about grief and resilience in the context of COVID, I hope that you see it in this way, or that we invite you to think about resilience differently, and that no one's asking anyone to bounce back or go back to normal, or feel like they can that they're able to go on with life in a way that feels healed, like everything's healed, but that we're talking about how do we hold space for both our broken parts and the parts that have some life as well. So how do we go forward? We go forward together. We go forward as a community. And that's really what this image of the people holding each other, that's what that's about. Is we have to see this in a communal way. And so we're gonna end this talk about grief and resilience around healing. So then how do we even incorporate healing into our grief and our grief journey? When we're forced to recalibrate to this new normal, how do we also heal while we're also trying to calibrate, while we're also trying to deal with the ever-changing pieces to both our loss and the pandemic? We learn to heal in community. We learn to heal by remembering how we've healed before. Nobody is ever going to suggest that the pandemic is a good thing. It's a painful experience that is going to require time. It's going to require shared reflection for meaning making. And it's going to require us to question our old assumptions about the world, about ourselves, and about how we relate to others. We may learn important things from this ordeal, and there's a sense in which maybe our souls can grow stronger, wiser, deeper through this terrible trial. There's a quote that I'm going to leave everybody with, which is sometimes it's a good thing to be reminded that we've not mastered the universe. And so it's just leaving us with that question of what else can there be? What else can I learn from this? How can I learn from myself? And most importantly, how can I learn from my person? Because they've left us with lots of things to carry with us, both attributes, teachings, maybe even hope. But it does take time for us to uncover those gifts. And during that time, you'll be doing your healing.
I like the piece around mastering the universe as well, because I think that as humans, to be present with the difficult, painful emotions associated with grief, both as a supporter or in our own bodies, we want to fix it. We want to have control over it. We want to make it feel smaller, or like it can give us room to breathe and to experience it and sit with it and not try to move it is a very, very challenging thing to do. But I want to honor each and every one of you that joined us tonight to in the work that you're doing, in the strategies that you're using to get through each day. And Alice talked a lot about at the end here about community and about engaging with this community. And yes, it hasn't been very interactive for us. We will be starting our grief chats again, and we would encourage you, if you feel like having some opportunities to talk to people, that will be available. We are still running our Friday grief chats. So if you're looking for some support through the month of December, we can let you know more information about that. Just connect with us and connect with each other. And it may look different, but it's important in the grieving process. So a reminder of spots to go for support. So your local hospice, as I said, in Peterborough, we are still offering group programs virtually, but they are still being offered. Also through your family physician. There are mental health clinicians attached to all of the family health teams in Peterborough, and you can access those through having a conversation with your physician and letting them know you need some additional support. There are, if you're employed, there may be benefits available through your employee assistance program, and leaning on those trusted family, friends, neighbors, co-workers who have been supporting you in your journey so far. There's also online resources, not the Megan Devine video, but the two other videos we saw tonight are from a website called Grief Stories, and you can go and search any term on Grief Stories, and different videos that connect to the term that you're looking for will come up. mygrief.ca has excellent resources, and if you're supporting children, kidsgrief.ca also has resources available to you. If you have any feedback, we are going to post our evaluation poll, but if you have additional feedback or additional needs for support, I welcome emails. As I say, I'll do my best to respond to those tomorrow. But my email's up on the screen. And then we are just wondering whether participating in this session makes it any more likely that you would join one of our online grief support groups. If you would attend this, if this program ran again in the future, if you found the time for tonight's session down at the bottom, I'm having trouble scrolling, so I hope you guys aren't having trouble scrolling, but there are a few more evaluation questions, and one of them is we want to know if these sessions are too short, too long, or just right. So we welcome your feedback, and as I say, please email if you have additional feedback or have additional support needs. Thank you so much for joining us. We will take a look at the chat box just to see, because I do know that there was some, oh, somebody says that they're using, oh, somebody's doing yoga, so some self-care. Someone else said at their work they're doing a window where they're placing stars or other shapes with their loved one's name on them to honor them. And then making donations to the food bank for each shape. And that's,
sorry,
Alice, I'm cutting you off, but it's a beautiful way to show how community and acknowledging and giving space to acknowledge your grief in your person can be really of value, especially in these times where we are feeling isolated.
And it's interesting because we've done this now. This is the third night we're together, and people have shared coping or memorial or meaning making strategies they've done. And every week there's new things that come up. Like, people are extremely creative and thoughtful in the way in which they do these gestures or these strategies. So I think it's just it's amazing to read some of the things that people are posting, because there's not really any duplicates. Like, everyone's very unique in the way they're doing their grief and coping.
And I want to thank all of you for sharing the names. I'm just getting a chance now to scroll back through the names of everybody who, as we said, they were all very present with you here tonight. And thank you for sharing their names with us.
And Gail is saying she's going to have a memorial Christmas tree in Peterborough Square this year for people that have lost their life to substance use. That's beautiful.
Someone else is making memory pillows out of their husband's shirts for their 4 children. I know those can be very cherished items.
And Gail has posted her email for anyone who would like to have their loved one on the tree. They can email her. Thank you, Gail. Thank you for doing what you're doing.
And thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Take care of yourselves. We will be meeting once again next week, and we're going to be discussing grief and the holidays. And so we welcome you to join us again. If you have something going on next week or aren't able to join us, these will all be posted to our YouTube channel.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Everybody.